In our JMC 420 class, we've been working on a Brandwatch project relating to the topic of locally grown food. So the campaign goals for this project was to generate awareness about sources of locally grown food in Lawrence and to encourage KU students to consume locally grown food in Lawrence. Some of the key insights I found from the Brandwatch data was that most of the top trending websites were Kansas local news outlets. The very first one was Twitter, but that's just because there's so many different mentions coming from all over the place. The other websites that were listed were not related to locally grown food or were about a different state other than Kansas. Out of all the mentions, 64% of them came from a male audience. There wasn't much information from women. Most of it was about agricultural business, farming. So there wasn't much information about farmers markets or any restaurants in Lawrence or anything that might entice more of a female audience. Out of all the mentioned, 62% of it had a neutral sentiment, meaning there wasn't any harsh negative or positive language. 21% had a positive sentiment and 17% are negative. The top hashtags are either a local news network in Kansas or National Farmers Day. National Farmers Day did occur October 12th, which did increase the Twitter mentions for locally grown food drastically. Out of the top emojis, the only one that really mattered to the campaign was the tractor. Some people would use that when discussing locally grown food or farmers. Out of all of the data, some of the key recommendations I came to was that a lot of the mentions about locally grown food came from an older generation or Generation Z. So the older generation doesn't matter as much, but for Gen Z specifically, I highly recommend running campaigns on social media to satisfy the targeted audience. According to the top sites tab, Twitter and the local news outlets were the most effective way to send information to the public about locally grown food in Lawrence. As I mentioned previously, since most of the mentions come from a male audience, I think we could start campaigning more towards the locally grown restaurants and farmers markets in Lawrence, and I think that would entice more of a female audience. I also believe that KU is to blame for the lack of knowledge in its students with locally grown food just because their dining plans have little to no locally grown food options available and there's no variety or diversity amongst meal plans. Some of the limitations of data I came up with was that a lot of the mentions we evaluated came from older generations, which is not our targeted audience of KU students. And it was really hard to determine the best way to campaign when there was such a lack of information on demographics. We only knew a Twitter username or a website. We don't know anything about the actual people talking and discussing locally grown food. Mentions also popped up from all over the country, not just Lawrence, Kansas, so I couldn't really use a lot of the information that came from elsewhere. A lot of the mentions from the older men had to do with the agricultural business, not specifically locally grown food. And then the Twitter mentions were complicated to sort through because when they would filter, whether it was like negative, positive, or neutral, it bases it off the word choice used. So once I went through the tweets, some of the negative tweets weren't actually negative. It just used negative word choice more or less, and vice versa for the positive. So I don't really trust the information on there.